So this panel, this lead-off panel, has the goal of looking beyond Europe and the United States to how disinformation campaigns affect democracies globally. I want to thank the Atlantic Council and the House of Sweden for bringing us together for this conversation. I think it's extremely valuable that we start the program early on by getting a sense of the variability of the threat in different contexts around the world. At the same time, as has been said, we have to remember to pick our heads up, connect the dots, and recognize the global nature of this threat to democracy writ large. Here in Washington, in light of new analysis and reporting in the past few weeks, it seems that people are starting to get their heads around how Russian disinformation actually worked and the very real world consequences and causal effect on the outcome of the 2016 election. That said, it is fairly disheartening that there is a basic lack of political will to address the vulnerabilities of our critical election infrastructure. In Europe, political actors have been seemingly more sophisticated in their defenses against disinformation and more proactive in regulating harmful content online. But sometimes they're doing that in ways that are very concerning from the vantage point of protecting free expression. This panel will widen the aperture beyond the US and the United States, beyond the transatlantic, give people a sense of the global dimensions of the threat, showcase how disinformation plays out in different contexts, and generate, hopefully, some practical ideas and solutions. We're going to start by looking at the many different manifestations of the threat. Sometimes some of these folks will speak about election contexts. Others will speak about disinformation that are not directly related to elections. Sometimes the campaigns have malign actors who work directly for the government or are state-sponsored. Other times the bad actors are just ideologues or digital mercenaries motivated by money. We also see a lot of variability in the mechanisms. Troll farms, bot armies that feed inauthentic amplification, micro-targeting that can deliver inflammatory messages to key subpopulations. Sometimes disinformation is spread on open forums, in closed communities, or even on encrypted platforms. While digital tech has facilitated global connectivity, it also means that anyone, anywhere, can impact civic discourse anywhere else. Instantaneous extraterritorial reach is now the default rather than the exception, and this extraterritorial reach is available to governments, hackers, civil society, and terrorists alike. And perhaps the hardest cases that we'll hear about are those where there is a bizarre interplay between authentic, domestic, civic discourse that is already polarized and divisive, mixing with memes and narratives fabricated by foreign trolls and spread by bots. At the end of the day, while these campaigns vary greatly, what ties them together is their destructive effect on the quality of civic discourse necessary to sustain democracy, whether they sow division and polarization or erode confidence in the integrity of a democratic process. The global endgame is to erode confidence in democracy itself. So we're going to start by looking at some of the local conditions, specific linguistic, religious, political contexts at play in the various places where these people work. We have four fascinating panelists, and we're going to discuss four cases: India, Kenya, Brazil, and also the case of Chinese influence operations across borders, especially in Africa. I will briefly introduce our panelists. Mr. Zahed Amanullah is head of network and outreach at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. He does research on, and capacity building on counter-narrative messaging campaigns. for non-governmental organizations in Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. He recently co-authored a cross-platform study of the efficacy of counter-narrative messaging. Mr. Pankaj Jain is founder of social media Hoax Slayer, a verification site aimed at combating disinformation across Indian social media platforms. Manufacturing entrepreneur and computer designer by day, he launched social media Hoax Slayer in 2015 as a means of debunking phony stories that spread particularly on WhatsApp. Ms. Nalon is executive director and co-founder of Fatos, is that right? Brazil's leading fact-checking platform. She's a journalist by training and worked for Folha de Sao Paulo for 6 years, and she has extensive experience covering public administration, national politics, and national security. And last but not least is Dr. Maria Repnikova, assistant professor of global communications at Georgia State University and director of the Center for Global Information Studies there. She's an expert on China's political communication, and her work examines critical journalism, political persuasion, and cyber nationalism in China, as well as China's global branding through cultural and communication initiatives, especially in Africa. So we're going to divide this conversation into 2 parts. We're going to start with diagnostics, and we're going to ask each panelist to give a snapshot of the distinctive features in their context. Then we're going to turn to solutions, what they're working on, which policies, practices, or tools show promise, which have been tested and look to be efficacious. I will say, unfortunately, there will not be time for Q&A. You can ask panelists questions in the break after, and we'll ask our viewers to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag StratcomDC. So we're going to start with the context in India with Pankaj. Tell us about the distinctive features at play there. Who are the bad actors? What's motivating them? To what extent are private sector technologies a big part of the problem?
See, basically, India is like obviously the largest democracy in the world, and we are talking about disinformation here. So while this a thing we had always been proud of, like unity in diversity, but now that thing is, this technology thing, the social media is breaking it off layer by layer every day. The disinformation, like people are, it's obvious, like India is the country which has largest number of language and religion, etc. So now like everybody is trying to jump on each other. So somehow these things is very serious now in our country. Basically it's about like politics and communal hatred over there.
So tell us a little bit about the role of private sector platforms in exacerbating the political divisions and social divisions that maybe even pre-existed.
Yes, it might have pre-existed because see, there are like they were talking about trolls and this. There are different levels of them who are doing it organized, very organized, doing it in an organized way. So there are private players who are doing this, who are handling things for a few political parties, etc. So yes, actually, it's getting very difficult day by day, and the election is near, quite near.
What's the primary motivation of the folks stirring up hatred and division?
The basic thing is like support, like it's global. Like many of the people are biased, like they are into a filter bubble, so they just do not let their views go out. They are not open to anything else. So most of, like in India, if they believe in some particular, like a politician or something, they will keep on moving and like trashing others who are not agreeing with them. So yes, of course, this faith and filter bubble is a basic thing behind it. But then it goes down to being famous and like being paid money, etc. It goes down to other factors as well.
Okay, so just I want to sort of just so we make some distinctions with the other context. Primary motivation, political and election driven or not?
Yes,
Yes.
Regional and political.
And the malign actors are domestic, foreign, or interplay?
Interplay, basically domestic.
Basically domestic. And do you want to say a couple of words about the WhatsApp context?
Yes, actually, this WhatsApp thing is getting out of hand because, see, they are working much on it, but one cannot backtrack. It's WhatsApp is the favorite tool for like these people who spread this communal hatred message. They pick up video from somewhere, some South America, and they said this is from India. This happened just yesterday. So they cannot be backtracked. And plus now there's given thing that one can delete his message. So now his slate is clean. Somebody cannot say, I can say like he sent me, but now when I go back, oh, it's deleted. So nobody can prove, nobody can be backtracked. So like yes, of course, WhatsApp is their favorite tool.
The encrypted piece.
Yes.
Yeah,
it's only because of encryption, and that's why they cannot let it go out.
Yeah. So obviously, much more complicated context. We can't get into everything. I've read in The Atlantic recently that there's been some diagnostics of pre-existing divisions that led to some of the physical violence and even killings, that it wasn't solely dependent on WhatsApp. But that's, maybe we want to save that for the next part of the conversation, unless you want to quickly jump in.
No, it's okay. I can
wait on that. Okay, so let's go to the context of Kenya.
Sure.
and Zahed. Tell us about what's going on there. My understanding is that extremists have leveraged social media to sort of create tribal division and violence, in particular around the 2017 presidential election.
Yeah, just to step back slightly, I mean, as an organization that's concerned with the rise of extremism, we've been primarily focused on non-state actors and how they leverage online tools to recruit and radicalize. In the last few years, we've seen a coordination between state and non-state actors in elections in Western countries, and we published many reports on elections in Europe, Italy, Germany. We have one coming out in Swedish elections, actually, shortly. But in Kenya, a couple of years ago, we decided to try to get ahead of the curve and to see how the online space was being exploited to destabilize the country, particularly in elections. I mean, it's a unique country in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. It's quite well developed, it has a high internet penetration, and is sort of ripe for the disruption that we've seen in other parts of the world, but of course the consequences are far greater. So we looked at the online.
Why are they far greater?
Well, because the reach is growing so rapidly, and the responses can't keep up with the ever expanding reach. So that growth is so quick that, for example, the social media companies themselves, the open platforms, Facebook, Google, and so forth, when we started our work, they were just setting up policy teams in East Africa. So in terms of how their platforms were exploited in that context, they may not have had the tools or the resources to address the issues. And so we work closely with them anyway. So we wanted to be part of that solution, bring them in as a partner, and analyze how those platforms are being exploited. So we conducted, I can tell you more about the work we did there to find out what the situation was. We conducted a study to find out actually how extremists were exploiting those platforms. And we found they were openly recruiting on pages that were openly supporting Al-Shabaab, ISIS, and other groups, but also that as elections were coming, groups that had tribal interests in promoting division along tribal lines. And remember, these types of divisions have led to violence in the past. In Kenyan elections, over 1,000 people died 10 years ago in elections. So we were very concerned about how the elections could exploit those divisions even further and serve as a proxy for electoral violence through tribalism. So the other issue is that we tend to sort of look at the disinformation from an English language perspective. What was missing in the Kenyan context is a lot was happening in Swahili. And when you look at languages like that, you have far fewer subject matter experts, far fewer data sources to understand exactly what is happening in that language. So a lot of the recruitment that we saw from extremist groups was happening deliberately in languages that were difficult to detect for Western, either Western NGOs or Western companies. So we found quite a volatile landscape. And this was not just us as an NGO. We worked with Kenyan partners, dozens of them, to analyze and actually make the connection between what was happening online with the ramifications offline. So our partners in Kenya saw the offline effects. We were able to connect the dots with what was happening online to produce those effects, primarily young Kenyans joining extremist groups in Somalia, but also participating in recruitment within Kenya itself. So that sort of set the groundwork for a response, and I can talk about that in the next.
Okay, so election context, obviously very important, but utilizing tribal narratives.
Exploiting, yes, exactly, natural divisions. And Kenya has, it's evenly divided between Christian and Muslim, between Swahili and English speakers. So there's a lot of potential fault lines for division to exploit. Even the political parties are largely separated on tribal lines.
Yes. Let me ask one more question. You talked about state and non-state actor interplay. How about foreign and domestic?
Yeah.
And in particular, reporting about the role of Cambridge Analytica.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sort of getting ahead a little bit, but what we ended up doing was working with NGOs in Kenya to produce messaging along 4 thematic areas that they felt, and actually from the research that we showed, were issues that were being exploited, not just by extremists, but by politicians as the election period came, which were electoral violence, extremism, tribal divisions, and religious intolerance. And we brought in partners, Facebook, Google, Twitter, all contributing resources, significant resources, for these organizations to produce messaging along those lines. We were very clear that we did not want them to be political. We were just trying to mitigate the effects that happen through the political process, the negative social effects. So because of that, we were able to produce, our partners were able to produce independently dozens of campaigns that we released on an ongoing basis through the election period in Kenya, which actually became an extended period because the original elections were nullified by the Supreme Court. So they reached every single Facebook user in Kenya. And at the time we did that, our partners in Kenya were telling us about ads that were being produced unattributed on behalf of the incumbent president, which were actually going against some of the campaigns that our partners were doing, exploiting extremism, exploiting tribal divisions, and so forth. And it turned out, we found out earlier this year, that those were produced by Cambridge Analytica. So we were literally, our partners were producing messaging in opposition to what Cambridge Analytica was doing in Kenya on behalf of the president. So it became a real indication of how easy it is for a foreign entity to sort of manipulate the discourse. I mean, I know the irony that we are an NGO that's working in Kenya with Kenyan partners, but we were actually very transparent. We had a press conference in Nairobi afterwards and told everyone exactly what we did and what we didn't do. Cambridge Analyticas don't do that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And you're using the digital platforms also.
Absolutely.
As counter.
Exactly. And it's the messaging itself, again, it's not casting aspersions on political lines. It's literally trying to produce messaging that encourages the voting population not to engage in electoral violence, not to engage in tribalism, not to engage in promoting any kind of extremism. Yeah. So those things nobody could argue against, even the Kenyan government.
So we'll get into that, the dual nature of the technology. It's still good, bad, and we need the good guys to dominate. Yeah. Okay, so let's quickly look to the context of Brazil, just for a counterpoint here. And just give us a sense, Ty, of the distinctive features that stand out. How is disinformation, digital disinformation, playing out in Brazil? What would you highlight there in terms of who are the malign actors, whether it's election context, foreign, domestic interplay?
We are in the middle, actually, of our general elections season. Our voting date is next Sunday, so we are 5 days We are 5 days from the voting day. And now we are facing major disinformation campaigns that are basically based on open social media, Facebook, Twitter. We are facing... Hello? That's okay? Okay. We are facing some trouble on open social media, organized social movements and publications that have ties to political parties. This on open social media.
Open.
Twitter, Facebook pages that are administrated by social movements, sometimes by political parties, but not transparently. And they have a major role on spreading misinformation in Brazil on open social media. But our main problem is WhatsApp. It's closed social media. Because we don't know for sure who is meddling with this kind of social media in Brazil. We don't have any idea by the campaigns to actually create hoaxes and false or distorted content to be spread on WhatsApp. But there are challenges on WhatsApp, right? Because we have the limitations of space. You have to have plenty of groups to actually weaponize information on WhatsApp. So it takes time for a hoax to spread on WhatsApp and then to get on open social media in Brazil. So we don't know for sure actually who is behind that, but we do know that it has political interest more than financial ones because it's harder to monetize through WhatsApp actually. So if the most relevant weapon of disinformation in Brazil is WhatsApp today, we can securely say that it's for political gains that people are spreading misinformation in Brazil right now. Okay. We have the other examples too of financial gains and everything, yes. But from 5 days for the voting day, I think that the weaponization is political, really.
Okay, and so that's very interesting. You've got multiple platforms, open, closed, encrypted.
Yeah.
But you see obvious political motivation at the heart of what's going on WhatsApp. And the actors, who are the actors you are hypothesizing and looking to diagnose as at the root of this? Who are they and what do they want?
We don't know for sure.
For sure. But what are you going to investigate? Let's put it that way.
For our experience debunking information online, we've seen that more conservative, more anti-LGBT, for instance, racist, homophobic, misogynistic content, they are really in the agenda of the most conservative players on social media. And these are the contents that are being more spread, either through social media, Twitter, Facebook, but through WhatsApp too. The problem is you have to have some kind of structure to diversify the quality of misinformation through those social media. On Twitter and Facebook, for instance, you have URLs or websites that are a part of a broader network of conservative websites that spread basically the same misinformation with some variations on content, but basically the same agenda. On WhatsApp, you have a more precarious, more, how can I say, a less qualified discourse. They are basically videos that are amateur and photoshopped images that are really poorly made. So we don't know for sure.
The fakes aren't even as good.
Yeah, the fake you don't. Yeah, it's crazy because a couple of weeks ago I was invited to talk about deepfakes on a TV show, And what I was actually saying was, it doesn't take a very Hollywoodian and prep to make people believe in what they want to believe.
Yeah.
The thing is, for you to diversify the means of disinformation in Brazil, they are so different on Twitter than on Facebook, from WhatsApp, that you cannot know for sure who's behind it yet. Mm-hmm. We are pretty sure it's a domestic problem. It's not an international problem. Mm-hmm. But we don't know for sure.
Okay, so far, the three contexts we've discussed, India, Kenya, Brazil, largely domestic actors with some foreign interplay. We're now going to turn to Dr. Repnikova and talk about Chinese cross-border information operations in the African continent, and you're probably going to pick out a few specifics. Give us a feel for what Chinese information operations look like. How are they different from Russian info ops that we're all much more familiar with? What are the peculiar Chinese characteristics that you're seeing?
Sure. So most of the kind of common interpretation or coverage of Chinese operations or global influence tends to focus on sort of sharp power, coercive interference, authoritarian nature of the party state. But my study of this phenomenon, and particularly in the African context, but also more broadly, highlights that it's actually much more subtle, indirect ways in which China attempts to influence certain information environments through a variety of actors that, as mentioned earlier, are not always official actors. They're often individual actors, businesses, media professionals, and others who don't necessarily align with or work directly with the government. So there are several so-called facets or features I wanted to highlight today, in particular speaking to the African context, which includes the withdrawal of information. So the notion that information is simply not provided for investigations or media coverage of China-related events, the export or sales of surveillance technology, so selling technology that helps empower surveillance in certain contexts. The third one is flooding of positive information, so overflooding of various kinds of positive reports on Chinese presence on the continent, but that also may speak to pretty much anywhere in the world where China is involved, and we see very positive reporting.
Okay, slow down.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit more about that spreading of Chinese information through what vehicles in Africa? Like, how is that? What does that look? We all know what it looks like in China. What does it look like for the Chinese to do that in Africa?
So in terms of just spreading positive information or China images, it happens through mostly state-owned media. So China has invested a lot of money. It's said that it's going to invest about up to 50 billion UN in 2009 on international campaigns through the media. And a large part of that is happening in Africa. So there's a flagship outlet in Nairobi, CGTN's outlet there. There's also Xinhua News Agency, the state news agency that has over 120 bureaus now across the continent. There's China Radio International, China Daily, and so forth, and more social media platforms arising as well through various circles like WeChat circles, Chinese equivalent of WhatsApp. So the campaigns are very much multifaceted, and the exposure through the media is really vast across the continent, in contrast to Western media actually shrinking.
And what kind of narratives are they pushing?
Well, the key narrative, as many of you might be aware of, is the win-win narrative. So it's all about equal collaboration, equal partnership. China as not replacing the West, but just contributing with a different perspective. So it's not about pushing out the West or being the dominant power. It's certainly not a colonial power. It's a power that tries to provide opportunities on the ground, and primarily through infrastructure. So if you open a China Daily newspaper, which I have on a daily basis when I lived in Ethiopia, you see a lot of construction projects, bridges, stadiums, all kinds of major projects that are being built. And indeed, on the ground, as soon as you land in Addis Ababa, you see a variety of signs in Chinese introducing the city to you in Chinese. So that's quite fascinating. So as you walk around, you see signs and buildings of everything, pretty much. All the major projects are built by China. So if you ask any officials on the ground, what their key opinions are about China, well, China is building everything. Where's America? Where's the West? That's the key comment that you hear from almost anybody involved in the official apparatus on the ground in Ethiopia or all over the continent, I would say.
So it's not like Russian disinformation in that it is necessarily sowing seeds of division or even fake, sort of misinformation type stories. It is more to control the narrative, and it looks much more like soft power, but it has a coercive edge to it so that it is beneficial to the Chinese.
Well, it looks a lot like soft power, and I think I would argue whether much of it has or does not have a coercive edge. I mean, if we think about Western media coverage or reporting or engagement in Africa, we also see an attempt at implementing soft power. So everybody wants their edge of influence in that continent, right? So we see a certain framing, for sure, it's pro-China framing, but beyond the framing, we also see practical opportunities that are provided to many members of African youth and officials to train in China. And it was mentioned at the beginning that some of these trainings in the Philippines, some of the people who travel to China might be learning how to manage the media or propagate, but there are also trainings about logistics, like how to operate, very basic things as a journalist. A lot of them are actually things that China learned from the West. So there's kind of a circulation of knowledge from the West to China and from China to Africa. So not all of it has a coercive or malicious content attached to it.
Yes. Okay. And just give us a sense of the particular places in Africa where you see this popping up or most insidious.
Well, in terms of just the media itself, the biggest hub for that is Kenya. That's where everything is based. But in terms of other elements, like, for example, I mentioned the exports or sales of surveillance technology, the latest interesting project is actually in Zimbabwe, where that's the first China AI project in Africa. There's sales of surveillance technology happening for the first time, which means that there's facial recognition, essentially, that's going to be empowered first in Zimbabwe, but potentially would spread to other cases, making Chinese technology increasingly more sophisticated. So that's another kind of a different case. So depending on which element of information we're looking at, there are different cases that emerge.
Yeah, so that's one of the concerns that I have, is that it's almost exporting this concept of digital authoritarianism, that the primary use of digital technology is not to expand free expression or to allow civil society to freely associate and assemble or connect globally. It is more service of the state and for authoritarian purposes.
Well, I just wanted to add that China is, of course, promoting its sovereignty model, which means that the governments are in charge of containing and regulating the web, and that's a model that has been promoting globally. So we've seen China Internet conferences taking place within China, various public diplomacy initiatives where it's essentially saying that in order for us to manage all of this misinformation that we're all discussing today, it's up to governments to do that. And that's the vision that it's been promoting alongside with Russia and many other countries that are joining into that vision.
Yes, that cyber sovereignty concept of internet governance, to me, undermines the concept that there are universal human rights and that there's an international human rights law basis for evaluating government treatment of citizens. That's part of what's going on with this cyber sovereignty. Where in Africa have you seen some uptake of this concept of cyber sovereignty?
Well, the uptake of the concept, it's a bit tricky because there's a lot of admiration or kind of aspiration towards Chinese media regulation model. So just having conversations with officials on the ground, for instance, in Ethiopia, people do note that this is really amazing how China manages to regulate its internet. In particular,
they like it.
They like it, but especially the point that was brought up, not only in my research, but also other cases like Tanzania and elsewhere, is that China managed to create its own internet giants, right? Its own platforms. So it doesn't need Facebook, it doesn't need Twitter, it doesn't need Google. So in fact, if Google were to re-enter China today, it might not necessarily succeed. I think it's very controversial to what extent it will succeed to win the Chinese market. So essentially, these governments admire this idea that China created its own counterparts, that it doesn't need to rely on Western technology and it can regulate them better. So there is this kind of excitement or at least inspiration drawn from that, as well as the laws, like regulating fake news, misinformation, rumors. China has effectively, well, the effects are mixed, but China has attempted to do that extensively over the past 5 years.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so when we come back to you on solutions, I want to hear about how we counter that aspiration. Sure. What do we provide as an alternative? So let's just come back and start now talking about your actual work and the solutions that you have seen that have either been tested and show promise in your context. Are you seeing primarily a lead by government in regulating content that's harmful? Are you seeing CivTech solutions, private sector platforms changing product or internal policies, media literacy? What are you finding shows promise in countering disinformation in each of your contexts? I'll start with you.
Okay, so about this, how people are working over there in country, government is trying to start a talk with social media giants and like WhatsApp, etc. So they are coming up with policies. WhatsApp, like for example, earlier WhatsApp was allowing us to forward to many but now they have restricted to 5. So that's a good approach. Then many private, like many channels, etc. also has come. See, in India there are so many languages. The point right now currently is there are many languages, there are many religions. So the most people who are being affected are who are not aware of other. They are only you might be aware in India, of course, smartphone cost has gone down, but data cost has drastically gone down. So now everybody, like even illiterates and people in villages, they are the two most used things are YouTube and WhatsApp. They don't know about Google, they don't know about Facebook, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, etc. So they are being consumed in the fake news being sent to them, the disinformation being sent to them on WhatsApp. They just blindly believe in it. So yes, of course, so now, okay, so my point is what I believe in, and few people have taken the initiative to reach out to these people in their own local languages, because they are not open to English or not even Hindi. So like if we reach out to them in their languages, the regional channels, the regional newspapers, that could be the best way to like curb the disinformation mess.
So very much local language, local culture, local religious context is part of the solution here in India. Right.
So the best way to reach out to them is the newspaper they read are in their own local languages. Yeah. The channel they watch is in the. So the best way to reach out to them is through this only.
And maybe with counter narratives.
Right.
So, all right. So let's go right there to your work on counter narratives.
Yeah, just along the same lines. I mean, one of the strategies that we've researched over the years that we found can be effective if done well is that, I mean, the response to disinformation really needs to be decentralized, and for that to happen, it really needs to be a civil society-driven approach. That's exactly the reason why we started with talking to civil society organizations in Kenya about their experiences and their capacity and how they felt they could respond, and informing the process, not controlling it, but providing resources and guidance and research for them to make the right decisions on how to effectively craft messages. At the end of the day, this is a battle for hearts and minds. Disinformation simply is an attempt to, shift that in a particular direction. And for the society, for the members of society who have a stake in how prosperous and how stable that society is, they're the ones who can really drive the messaging about what their ideals are, what their vision is for their society. So, so in these messages that we had, these campaigns that we had our partners make, we wanted to make sure that they were obviously changing hearts and minds. First was the reach, making sure that everyone was able to see them. And actually, it costs surprisingly little, for example, to promote a campaign across every Facebook user in Kenya. There's only about 4.5 million at the moment. It's growing rapidly, but it was in the sort of $10,000 range. You could literally reach every Facebook user. That's what Cambridge Analytica did as well. But more importantly is, how do you demonstrate that those messages are actually changing hearts and minds for the better? And so we conducted a broken link survey of 25,000 online users in Kenya around 4 representative examples of these thematic campaigns, and measured up to 50% positive attitudinal shift compared with a control group. So, which was really encouraging for us. I mean, it's hard to be that targeted in a developing country when it comes to making sure the right audience sees the right message, which is key in terms of messaging. You really want that. But by separating it into thematic areas and putting it around the election when everyone was active around all of this across the country, our aim became mass reach, and then hoping that the right people saw the right message because of that mass reach. And then, of course, measuring that attitudinal shift meant that we were definitely on the right track. I mean, anecdotally, we can say that far, far fewer people were dying as a result of electoral violence, even though it was a very volatile. I mean, when I gave my press conference in Nairobi, the opposition leader was crowning himself president in a park across the street, and yet, things actually didn't, get out of hand. So I think there is, and once civil society has the tools to do this, they can learn from it and keep going. It's really not that hard.
So let me ask a challenging question. I really like this idea of civil society-led approach to the solution. I love that. However, I think there's another dimension of civil society-led that's not only about counter-narratives and winning hearts and minds, but more about civic education, media literacy, and simply getting the consumers of digital information to be more savvy and skeptical and internalize a sense they don't want to be duped.
That is half the battle right there.
Yeah.
It's more, we actually do engage in a lot of digital literacy programs in Europe, with partners like Google, for example.
Yeah.
And in a place like Kenya, that's one of the first things we encourage our social media partners to do is to get involved in digital literacy efforts in those countries. I mean, those are really resource intensive. I mean, you have, a massive population to reach of varying degrees of literacy.
Yep.
It's quite an endeavor, but it is critically important because even our messages will not resonate unless people know how to distinguish them from disinformation.
That's right. So I know that it's time consuming, it's labor intensive, it's costly, but it's needed. It's needed. It's underdeveloped. I think people don't appreciate the potency if we do it well.
And feeding it into the existing educational framework is probably the best way to do that. So you have to work. This is where you have to work closely with governments and try to get them on side to treat digital literacy as a key component of their educational policy.
All right, let's turn now to Brazil. What are you finding is effective in countering disinformation there? What are the solutions that you would advocate for?
It's tough to say because, well, we are, as I said before, we are in the election week, and we are seeing the public discourse being actually eroded by disinformation campaigns, hate speech sometimes, and this is actually something that is going on right now. So we don't have a solution because if we had, this wouldn't be happening. But we know that we can take some actions that are very specifically driven for social media. For instance, we at Fatos, we develop artificial intelligence to tackle disinformation online. Of course, it's small. We are a small outlet. There are other media platforms or organizations that are way broader than Fatos, and they are much more well-equipped to actually not debunk, but spread their content through society. Journalistically speaking, like content on the web, on the newspapers, on TV, on radio stations. We are a continental country, so this is very important. But
can I just double check? You said AI based, so I take it that is AI detection of false or misleading news?
Not detection, but spread of verified content, of fact checks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So amplification?
Amplification, yeah. Actually, on Twitter, we are tackling it for about 3 to 4 months. We basically developed a robot that maps URLs, links to fake or distorted content that we have already debunked, and send to the person that has shared that content a warning. Oh, you are spreading fake news. Try to see our fact check right here.
I see.
In order to, it's based on the premise that everyone who has been exposed to false or distorted content has to have access, to verified content. What she or him will do about it, we don't know. But we feel that people have to be aware they are consuming a low-quality content. On the meantime, we have developed a chatbot on Facebook that gives tips to people on how to verify content. So basically, everyone can go to our webpage on Facebook and ask for the bot how to debunk a hoax on WhatsApp or a potentially fake video or a potentially faked image or fraud. Of course, these are solutions that are in a very small scale right now. But we feel that we are at the beginning of a battle of disinformation and misinformation. Whoever will be elected next Sunday and at the second round in the end of October. However, we have seen digital platforms take actions against the proliferation of fake news or disinformation. Mostly Facebook and Google, Twitter not that much. I mean, this Twitter bot we have developed, we haven't had any kind of support from Twitter to putting it on air. But we have a media literacy project based on artificial intelligence that is funded by Facebook and other smaller funding from awards and social society altogether, but they are pretty small.
Yeah.
I mean, what I say in Brazil is that this epidemic of misinformation is mostly like we have faced 20 years ago when we started receiving email viruses. We actually they haven't stopped. They are out there yet. But we have learned to deal with it. We don't open virus in our emails so often as we did those years ago.
So it's early days of
Yeah.
data testing.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to Maria and talk about solutions as it relates to Chinese influence operations in Africa.
So the question you posed kind of at the beginning, like how can we counteract this internet sovereignty agenda just more broadly, I think it's a very big challenge right now, in particular because the internet freedom agenda requires, I think, more practical explanations, like what are the practical benefits of embracing this agenda? Because if you think about all these things we're discussing today, extremism, all sorts of interferences into domestic domains, the reaction of many governments is we just need to regulate it ourselves. So it's very hard to embrace this internet freedom agenda for a government that's already more keen on more autocratic sort of ways of managing the internet. So I think there needs to be a much better job at explaining the more practical dimensions of more free and open internet to various societies, as opposed to just sticking to more ideological way in which we used to explain it, where the US is simply superior and we can just explain the world as we see it and everybody else will embrace it. Right now, many hypocrisies of that are coming out with companies like Google re-entering the Chinese market. It's becoming visible that this agenda is not quite holding up. So I think we need to do a much better job at articulating the actual benefits to those various governments, because as much as civil society is a great thing, without the governments, we're not going to be able to change that much, I believe.
So I completely agree with that. I was talking to the Swedish ambassador in our meeting earlier about just 6 years ago, Sweden led the first UN resolution on internet freedom. Back in a very different moment where the narrative of the open, interoperable internet was dominant. And the fact that we have turned so sharply in the other direction, I agree with you, we need to be advocating for the vision of internet freedom again and hold on to that concept. Quick comment, we're at the end of our time. If you have anything that you would like to share based on what you've heard from each other about lessons learned from distinct contexts, distinct linguistic contexts, religious contexts, political contexts, that is relevant to the global battle that we are all in. One last comment you would make.
Everybody's trying to contribute to stop this disinformation thing. The problem lies with, as she was saying, that she's telling someone, their bots are telling someone that you were wrong. What if he wanted to do it? So the point is, we are currently stuck in a position where people are not having an open mind. So they just don't want to learn. The problem is, technically we can solve it, but we have very small reach. How do we tell people that you need to be open to everything? You need to check the fact, you need to check the credibility to the message you have received. Just don't forward it blindly, because I don't know if you're aware, on WhatsApp because of this messages, I'm not blaming WhatsApp, I'm sorry, but because of the messages, there had been few lynchings and like few people are killed in India. It's not political, it's not communal. Just because somebody, like, we are so possessive about our kids, somebody sent a video that, okay, these are people are kidnapping kids. So people were so, they found someone and they lynched them. So like, we need to check out the sources. WhatsApp is not a news source. We need to tell people it's not your news source.
Back to civic education.
Right,
Yep.
back to civic education.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that civic education is the most relevant action we can support right now. But we have to keep in mind that with we don't know what will happen in Brazil, but with a much authoritarian discourse being legitimized in our society, it's difficult for us to believe that we can actually sit with the government right now and set an agenda against disinformation. If this very government that will be elected, I don't know, in the next 3 weeks, is actually leading an effort on disinformation. So, yeah, it's a contradiction that we have to tackle. So we have to rely on society, social organizations.
You're
because
not alone in that regard.
Yeah, because because I think that it's the only way. And yes, we have to make campaigns and still talk about it. We have to keep on talking about it for people to getting to know that it has consequences, and the consequences can be different for each kind of actor. I mean, it's difficult. If we had a solution, we wouldn't be here.
Early days. Okay.
Yeah, just building on what Ty and Pankaj have mentioned, I mean, this isn't so much a technological or political phenomenon as a cultural phenomenon. And it may be a generation before things stabilize. We don't know. In the meantime, we each have to look at our strengths, whether they're a particular sector or particular organizations, and do what we can to help push in the right direction. For us, as an organization that's dealing mostly with the rise of extremism, our role, we feel, is to help mitigate the negative consequences of all of this as it relates to on the ground, particularly with people resorting to violence. That's what we would do. I think if we all work together in our respective areas of expertise and coordinate more effectively, I mean, there's a lot of dialogue. I mean, this is a great example of getting a lot of different partners in the room who are dealing with different aspects of this phenomenon. Getting us to work and coordinate together more carefully, I think we can push forward in a positive direction.
Great. Maria?
Yeah, I mean, echoing on all of that, I guess it's just about sharing certain lessons, but also in thinking about the Chinese context and learning from all of you. The idea of literacy, I think there's a fundamental kind of need for just more education and more information about just, in general, what China is in the world, not only in Africa, but in other contexts it's entering. It's a huge sort of new power that many people are just unaware of from all dimensions. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on very fundamental literacy, just on what China is in the first place, and then what it's doing when it comes to information and media. So there's a whole lot of work to be done in that area, I think.
Okay, thanks so much. I hope this panel has given you a sense of the variability across the globe, and yet also conveyed on some level we are absolutely all in this together, and all stakeholders, government, certainly civil society, private sector actors need to be working together to solve this threat. So let's give a thanks to our panel.